All right, so there's all these benefits to religious belief. I'm going to get into that later. That's probably all I'm going to write on the board. There's a lot of replicated studies on this, and what I'm going to do for now at least is I'm just going to give you a sort of a sampling of the different varieties of benefits that are offered. People who believe in God are happier than agnostics or atheists, says a study by Andrew Clark for the Royal Economic Society. Using data from Britain and Europe, the study found believers enjoyed higher levels of satisfaction and suffered less psychological damage from unemployment, divorce, or the death of the partner. So that's a mental impact. What's the possible mechanism for this? There's several potential things. The most compelling for me is serotonin. This is a comparison of serotonin levels measured against people's scores on these two faith psychometrics, spiritual acceptance and self-transcendence. This actually measures serotonin binding potential. So the lower your binding potential is, the higher your serotonin level is. And I'll talk about this more. It's really cool. Maybe later I'll tell you about the atheist mice experiment. But it's kind of peripheral to the point I'm making at present. So longevity. A 5-year study of 2,000 old people found that the people who believed in God were 36% less likely to die during the follow-up period of 5 years. When variables were controlled for, age, sex, marital status, number of chronic diseases, lower body disability, balance problems, exercise, smoking status, alcohol use, weight, 2 measures of social functioning and social support, and depression, when all that stuff was controlled for, the people who believed in God were still 24% less likely to die during the follow-up period. So it's possible that faith acted on these other factors, but in and of itself, it seemed to account for a substantial chunk of the longevity in that study. And centenarians, people lived to be 100, disproportionately report a strong religious faith. So what are some possible mechanisms of this increase in longevity? There's several possible things. People that score high on religiosity psychometrics have lower rates of diastolic hypertension. They have lower plasma interleukin 6 levels. I don't really know what that is, but it seems to be associated with all kinds of badness, so you don't want it. Most compelling to me is this study of HIV positive women that was done last year. It of course found inverse associations between depressive symptoms and religiosity. And it also found a positive association between religiosity and immune cell counts. But really interestingly, the depressive symptoms were not accounted for the depressive symptoms did not account for the immune cell disparity as well as religiosity accounted for the immune cell disparity. There was a much stronger correlation between religiosity and the immune cell count. So presumably not only did religiosity help the immune cell count via reducing depression, increasing mental state, but through some other factor. So we also know that religiosity has a big heritable component. Pretty much any religious psychometric we look at, there's a big chunk of it that turns up as heritable in twin studies. My favorite twin study is, of course, the Minnesota twin study, which compared hundreds of sets of twins separated at birth and raised apart. Mostly I like that study because it agitated politically correct people so much. And they've all been pretty consistent. Big chunk of heritability for religiosity. So we know that it emerged from the evolutionary process. So how did it emerge from the evolutionary process? What was the final evolutionary benefit? The one I'm going to focus on for now is from Bjorn Grinda, who's an evolutionary psychologist. 10 minutes, thank you. Bjorn Grinda, who's an evolutionary psychologist, says that religiousness addresses the collision between animal emotions and human intelligence. So this is kind of a staple of day-age creationism, which I subscribe to, that the origin of mortality in the fall refers not to the literal or beginning of physical death. It refers to people acquired through consciousness and awareness and sadness over death. So essentially, through God, people feel that they're released from that sadness and have hope for a destiny beyond death. And this releases, according to Grinda, energy for the other functions of life, namely survival and reproduction. So it's selected for. There's some other final mechanisms I can talk about later, but that's the most compelling one, I think. And Dawkins, I'm going to talk about Dawkins a little bit. Dawkins says actually that there is zero evolutionary utility to faith. He says that faith is just a virus of the mind. It capitalizes on evolutionarily useful stuff, like hyperactive agency detection. That's the thing that makes you suspect there's someone in the closet when you hear a noise. But in and of itself, it's just a self-replicating meme. It actually doesn't do anything to help you. It's that it latches on to these other things that actually help you. And I'll talk about why I think that's dumb in a minute. So what does all this say about the truth value of faith? Wilson is a deist. E.O. Wilson is the founder of sociobiology, and he's a deist because of his sociobiological research. He says all this stuff is a compelling reason for affirming faith. Grinda's a theist. I'm fairly certain he's a Christian. But he communicates what I would say is probably the default Christian reaction to all of this stuff. And he says, I am afraid that all of this research will lay bare the nature of religion and discredit it. It's going to make faith seem insincere and unfounded. Now, an important question, I think, is if Grinda thinks this, Grinda who is a theist, why doesn't Dawkins jump on board with this and say, yes, this evolutionary psychology research discredits theism and lays bare its nature. That's what all these benefits for religion do. They just show us it's merely a product of evolution and nothing more. And I think the reason Dawkins doesn't do this, and he's consistent on this no evolutionary utility thing, is he recognizes that the evolutionary utility of faith is an argument for the truth value of faith. And he doesn't want to paint himself into a corner by conceding otherwise. I think he's an intelligent guy. He's too smart for that. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Last year there was this study that used this psychometric called benevolent sexism. People that score high on benevolent sexism believe there are deep innate differences between the sexes and that women are the weaker sex and deserving of male protection. I don't necessarily think that's a sexist belief, but that's what the psychometric is called. And it found not only did men who scored higher on benevolent sexism report higher levels of self-satisfaction, but women that were in relationships with men who scored high on benevolent sexism had higher levels of self-satisfaction. So when this study came out, do you think establishment feminists rejoiced and said the nature of sexism had been laid bare and discredited? No, probably not. They didn't like the study. I've been on for about a month the paleo diet, which is sort of an attempt at reconstructing what our ancestors might have eaten tens of thousands of years ago. The FDA doesn't like it very much because it's pretty much the inverse of their food pyramid. If a big study came out tomorrow that said there was evolutionary utility to the paleo diet and it said it conferred all these health benefits and happiness benefits, would the FDA rejoice and say that the nature of the paleo diet had been laid bare and discredited, and now we know how stupid all these paleo dieters are? No, they wouldn't say that, of course not. By what measure does showing that there are benefits to a behavior lay bare or discredit that behavior? By no measure, it doesn't. It doesn't work with gender or with diet because it doesn't really work with anything. We don't apply this thinking to anything except religion. If you do not perceive God's existence, if you don't have, faith, the emotional perception of God, on your blank agnostic scoreboard, all of these benefits, the evolutionary utility of faith, should be a point for God on your scoreboard. We know that there are at least some tangible here and now benefits to faith as opposed to atheism's evolutionary utility of zero. So it's not Pascal's wager. It's an observable, it's a replicated treatment. It's not just a guess, it's something that might happen after you die. You know that there will be immediate benefits here and now. Not only is this what we would expect from a God involved in our creation, we would expect the mechanisms for self-transcendence to be included by a God who created us, but we know there's immediate benefits. So what does atheism offer to replace the observable benefits of faith? So if theism, is a useless virus of the mind that capitalizes on evolutionarily useful stuff, we would expect a high IQ, well-educated, literate group like atheists, and atheists are all those things, atheists are a very capable demographic, to be able to just make a list of the good, healthy things that theists do, and just do those things without the religious mumbo-jumbo. And in fact, if that were the case, atheists might even make a better list than Christians or another religious demographic. But atheists don't do this. Atheists turn out comparatively poorly on these happiness tests I was referring to earlier that contrast them with theists. So if if you can just make a list of the healthy stuff theists do and do them without the mumbo jumbo, do irreligious people tend not to do these things? Why do we still see this disparity? And in fact, like I talked about earlier, when I referenced some of these studies, no matter how many factors we control for, if you say, oh, it's just because religious people smoke less, it's just because religious people socialize more. When we control for these factors, we still see a benefit to faith. Why is that the case if religion just capitalizes on this useless stuff? When someone says that religion got us this far, but we don't need it anymore, it's always important to ask them, well, why don't we need it anymore, and how did we outgrow the use for it? I definitely wouldn't expect Andrew to advocate that position, but I would not be surprised if Andrew referred to faith in God as being just one superstition on the spectrum of equally silly, superstitious beliefs. 5 minutes? Okay, I'll wrap up here in a minute, actually. So when I ask atheists why they don't call themselves agnostics, a pretty standard response is, well, I'm an atheist the same way I'm an atheist towards unicorns. It's, theism is just one belief on this spectrum of equally silly beliefs. So Andrew gave the example of gnomes last time, I think. So the reason I think that doesn't work is I think we hold faith to a much higher standard than we hold these other myths. So if alone on the spectrum of equally silly beliefs, we found that people who believed in gnomes had higher immune cell counts, and centenarians, people who lived to be 100, disproportionately had a strong belief in gnomes, I think that we would take another look at this gnome thing. And I think if we're being intellectually honest, we should apply the same thinking to God. And I'll leave everything else for my rebuttal to Andrew. Thank you.